brief you about the schedule of the event today, we'll begin with our first panel discussion on e-commerce growth story in India. Now I'd like to request eminent panelists, as I name them, to come on the dais and take their seats so that we can begin with the first panel discussion. I'll begin with Ms. Aruna Sharma, former Secretary, Government of India, Mr. Lloyd Mathias, angel investor, Mr. Ashish Sikka from Ecom Express, Mr. Rajat Yadav from Invest India, Ms. Sabina Diwan from Justjobs Networks and CPR, Mr. Vinod Kumar from India SME Forum, and in the end, I would request Mr. Anil Padmanabhan, an eminent journalist, former managing editor of Mint, to kindly come on the dais and moderate the session. Please, Mr. Anil.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you, ISB, for having me here. So-called, within quotes, renowned journalist. So welcome all. And thank you for the very professorial intro, rather. I don't think I've heard. I'm reminded of Schumpeter, which I read about in Delhi school. I won't reveal, many zillion years ago. So it is nice to go back, and destructive creativeness is a very nice term to define today's age. Actually, we got a great panel, so I won't come in the way of these domain experts that we have lined up here, because we got a limited time frame of about 45 minutes. And the format is that each of the speakers will go for about 3 to 4 minutes based on the questions I'll ask them. But I just wanted to set the context, just to take up from where he left off. India is poised to onboard this next 500 million people. And this is, for the first time, traditionally we have tried this, but the enabling ecosystem has been missing. And today the good news is an enabling ecosystem is slowly and steadily falling in place. And look at the infrastructure. Rural road networks are nothing like what it used to be 20 years ago. And you have the public digital goods like ONDC, which he mentioned. And of course, this optic fiber network that is now crisscrossing India. About 60 to 70% of even rural India is now covered. So probably another 2 years, all of India will be on a very robust broadband network, which is like building a highway, which is an express highway. I just picked up a World Bank report just today morning, and it had this very interesting stats. I'm sure all of you know, but I'll just recall. It says that 10% increase in mobile broadband network adoption causes a 0.14% increase in GDP. So you can do the math. And a 1% increase in mobile penetration leads to a 0.12% increase in Human Development Index in South Asia. So there is a great, I think, as I love to keep saying, India's best is yet to come. And I'll stop there. And Avik has given us serious guardrails, so I will stick to that. And the question format will follow the same guardrails. So I'll begin with Aruna Sharma. Ma'am, you've been in government for a long time, and you've seen e-commerce, you have shaped the e-commerce policy in this country. So, can you share the perspective that when you were in government, and how you shaped it and how you have grown this entire behemoth that we have today?
Thank you so much. Of course, e-commerce has a long history, even before internet, where the old computers used to be exchanged, like through a small network systems. But from there it evolved more so when the digital payment system became robust. So electronic payment started from 2012, where DBT, we made it from all G2P, and that was a trigger point. And then, of course, the digital payment made the whole difference as we go ahead with it. That digital payment with pandemic accelerated the pace for e-commerce. Absolutely no doubt about it. So all fence sitters moved. But in the policies, it is very important that at that time, it was the consumer's preference to go for the e-commerce platform for their way they shop. And that included every kind of product, and even the government went for GEM. So that all procurement of the government also became like an e-commerce model through the GEM, where the aggregated demands were kept and payments were done through PFMS. So the payment system and the consumer's choice became together. But having said that, what is very, very important during the evolution process and the policy making, what he was saying, it was very important to cover some of the aspects. One aspect is how a person, a manufacturer, conveniently boards the e-commerce platform. So you have now the talk about having open source kind of a platform which will make it easy for people to board. But then just platform is not the answer. So you board a platform which is preferred by the consumers, which is visited more by the consumer, which is thrown up by the consumers, and you have an option to have an array of choice for the kind of product you are looking for. So one is boarding, and in that, I will like you to remember that, and which was said very rightly in the introduction, that just boarding requires your indirect taxation of GST. It requires your MIT to come into the picture. It requires commerce and consumer affairs. So 4 ministries have to come together just for the one clause of how we make it easy to board, including the SMEs, where it is very, very important to get involved for them to have a product exposure. Then you come to the way the investment confusion came for the e-commerce platform into the logistics, because they are so entwined that the confidence of the timely logistics is very, very important to whosoever is operating the e-commerce platform, and restricting it to 26% of the investments is one of the things which is again getting debated when we have got now all the ministries put together to come up with a Digital India draft policy, which will be all comprehensive to break the silos and bring them together. And that is where the alertness level has to be there the moment the draft comes out as to how we are going to respond to that draft. So that, all these learnings which has come over a period of time comes through. Today we are talking about that it will become a $3 billion industry. That kind of a jump is what is envisaged in the e-commerce way of doing. And everybody is boarding. During pandemic, the hybrid model emerged. So you had a physical shop and you had an e-commerce outlet for it. It also helped into the export market. I keep on saying about the textiles. During pandemic, very intelligently, the textile used the e-commerce platform to penetrate into the European and US market. And today we are ruling the roost there. So in the sense, it gives an opportunity for you to widespread your catchment area of your consumers and spread across the borders when you are moving ahead with it. So the second thing comes is the kind of investment you are doing into the logistics or the related things, whether we want it restricted to 26% or we want a change into the whole system. Then third comes is that the consumer's description of the product. That is where the hand-holding has to be done by the e-commerce with the consumers when we are going in the policy making, so that the right brief is available to the consumer to make a choice. And that is where the whole battle was, that whether some products are pushed ahead, some products are kept behind by the e-commerce platform. So that equity status has to be consciously brought about, which is a part of the policy focus when through various stages it has gone, and it will also emerge into the final draft, which is going to come up very soon. After this is the grievance redressal kind of a thing. And before that, I will say about the payment structure. We have a continued battle with the RBI on the payment system, because e-commerce platforms are merchants. At the end of the story, in the payment lineage, then they are the merchants, the end point, which is a front face to the consumers. So any default which happens in the payment, anything going wrong, or any of the product has to be returned, the payment has to be got back, whatever it is there, the front face is the e-commerce platform. And therefore it is very important that the various things which are being tried, whether it is tokenization, now date is extended for it because of the unpreparedness of the various systems into it, or whether the e-mandate. We have seen the setback which came because of the e-mandate systems and the time taken for the payments. Like if you look at it, the credit card can handle, credit or debit card for that matter, can handle a huge number of payments per second or per minute, vis-a-vis what we are talking about tokenization. So it is going to be a disruptor, and therefore it is very important to get into it, to what extent we want to go to tokenization and to what extent to remain. I was a member of that deepening digital payment committee of the RBI, where we made these standing instructions possible in debit card. But with tokenization and e-mandate, I think we are reversing that step. So that argument is going on, which is to be handled in the policy making. So in the first policy making, what we did then was to allow the debit cards to have the standing instructions so that you can make the payments. So the payment systems. And then, of course, the grievance redressal and the delivery. Along with that, there is an improvement in the governance, your address system, your location mapping, all that has gone through a complete transformation. And of course, supplemented what Anil has rightly said by the internet connectivity, which is going very fast. The smartphone population is also increasing. And the sandbox is there where we are working on it, whether the feature phones can also handle to some extent into this, because 50% of the population continues to be feature phone. So that is how the whole scenario is working in the policy. When you look at it, that e-commerce policy cannot be in a silo. And now the government, under the banner of Mighty, has brought all these silos under one umbrella. The existing policies, we have gone through a system, we have seen how it managed to get more and more consumers and more people to board on the e-commerce platform, but irritants are there. And that irritants and pain points needs to be handled in the new policy making that is coming. And the more you participate into that entire system of drafting and commenting on the draft, then the credibility, the continuity of the policy, the less of the flip-flop will continue as we are moving ahead, along with the umbrella of cybersecurity. And we have minuscule incidents of cybersecurity. And that's why, personally speaking, I'm never in favor of tokenization. To handle that decimal, why do I need an axe? You know, I don't need an axe for that. So these are the initial comments I'd like to make, that these are the things which are to be flagged, to be answered with clarity. It exists in the present policies, but these irritants have emerged and we know where the confusion is. That needs to be well worded, well written and clear, so that there is no confusing from any arm of this silo, and this becomes like a practice when we go ahead with the spread of e-commerce, which is going to stay, which is a new pattern of business, and that is how it is going to be, whether it is B2B, B2C or C2C, whatever form you want to go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for setting the context so well. And I'll just add that audio-based tech is probably going to bridge that feature phone deficit that you mentioned. Lloyd, I'll come to you next. You, unlike ma'am, you're looking outside inside. So can you share your perspective on e-commerce?
Thanks, Anil. And I think Ms. Sharma gave a great outline of the entire policy framework. I think looking outside in, as you said, Anil, I think if I were to just broadly contextualize where we are and the criticality of e-commerce, I think if you look back at the last 30 odd years, post-liberalization, I think there were three big phases of the India story, right? The first was really the IT revolution, right? What really made India the back-end center of the world, right? So kind of services and India became synonymous. The next really was telecom, right? What happened in the early stages of the telecom development, and more specifically in the last decade when a disruptive player made India the lowest priced data center of the world, right? That was a huge enabler. And I think we are in the throes of what I would call the next big leap, which is partially been aided by the pandemic, which is this whole growth of the e-commerce sector, right? So it was in some form through, post the Geo launch and such like, we saw huge uptake of digital services. But specifically in the last few years, I think we're seeing it reach down the population strata. And the two data points that you mentioned, Anil, specifically, is how telecommunications works as an enabler, right? So the moment you get deeper internet penetration, the moment we get larger depth of smartphones, you see an immediate uptake in digital services, right? We are talking right now of close to 400 million Indians transacting digitally, right? So this is people who are actually making some form of digital purchase and making a payment through online, which, as the world recognizes, is more than the population of the United States, right? So it's that significant. Our ticket sizes may be considerably smaller, but the reach and the depth that e-commerce is getting into is something that is absolutely significant. The second point, and maybe purely as an investor, is the fact that now this is no longer an urban phenomena, right? The depth of e-commerce is reaching smaller towns. In the first phase of the pandemic, a lot of us in the city saw the fact that there was huge adoption by people of a slightly older demographic, right? Earlier, digital was considered something that younger people do, right? When the lockdown happened in March 2020, we saw pretty senior citizens as well now resorting to it, right? Digital payments have reached an incredible level. I think in this context, I just have two key points to make. I think one is that the government has to play the enabler, but not get into the nitty-gritties of how a business is run, right? There is a great temptation of our policymakers to actually try and dictate terms. So I think the core has to be about how does the government play an enabler. And within that, the primary focus has to be how does the consumer interest be kept top of mind, right? Because while there are various groups that tend to want to influence policy, I think eventually what's good for the consumer, a good, competitive, efficient marketplace, is good for the industry, and the entire value chain develops. So I think that's, I would say, one of the key elements in the policy-making framework. The second, I think, is transparency and equality, right? So treating both online and offline, and as Mr. Sharma rightly said, the future is going to be hybrid, right? We will be transacting in a hybrid manner. When you go to a store, you've got your smartphone with you, and when you're at the smartphone, sometimes you want to go and physically see things. And God forbid, with the enablement of the metaverse, with blockchain, these things will become reality. You might actually be able to stay home and get a touch feel of the real product. So I think the second element is how does policy create a level playing field so it doesn't have to make difficult choices for consumers, keeping that same principle in mind. So I would say looking at these two aspects, I think that is the core of what it does. Lastly, in purely investment perspective, I think this is the big space. I think what we've seen in the growth over the last 5 or 6 years is that the growth of e-commerce has enabled an ecosystem right across, from small retailers, small manufacturers sitting in remote parts of the country, who are now able to reach not just a pan-India audience, but indeed a global audience. I think that has exposed, that has been a tremendous benefit. And unlike in the past when a lot of these people had to fight a lot of infrastructure, today the whole infrastructure process is gradually being put in place. So I think that has been a hugely positive development. So my two key messages, one is the simplicity of policy, keeping consumer interest in mind at one. Two is to have a level playing field and to take off any level of complexity that there exists today.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you. I think you summed it up very well that the democratization of our markets has begun, but you need good guardrails to ensure that the friction is as minimal as possible. Rajat, I'll come to you next. You are in the hot seat because everything on FDI goes through you. So, and ma'am had laid out, she just touched on it, that it's a little sensitive issue. So how do you view the whole business of foreign investment in e-commerce?
I think already a lot of credible points have been made here in terms of the larger ecosystem and the key enablers that are enabling investments into India. I like the point you made earlier, the factoid on how the internet penetration in India actually results in a certain increase in the GDP, and that's a figure that certainly I'm also familiar with. And we certainly have like 800 odd million people who are now who have access to internet. While we talk about, Mr. Mathias also spoken about the key enablers in terms of the IT revolution, telecom, and how, the entire industry has certainly evolved in a manner where we are able to leverage our favorable demographics to build a bigger market in place. And that's why there's been a significant interest from foreigners also to invest in India and leverage on the India growth story. So when we talk about larger ecosystems, on one side you have these favorable demographics, India being a great economy to invest into. And on the other side is, in some ways, the foreign direct investment policy. At least the way I see it, how the Ecom policy has evolved, in some ways has enabled investments to come into India. When I talk about the foreign direct investment policy vis-a-vis with regard to the e-com space, there are two main areas that I see within e-commerce policy which have drawn a lot of investments. You have your pure play marketplace models of e-commerce, and of course you have your single brand retail traders, trade being another format which now has access to e-commerce, and you see a lot of companies coming into India and leveraging that option and not only doing offline retail, but as the term goes, omni-channel or hybrid models, accessing internet as a channel to reach out to larger set of consumers as well. And this e-com policy has, of course, evolved in the past 2 decades. The government tried to regulate this space by making 100%, by allowing 100% foreign direct investments into the e-com space, specifically in B2B e-commerce transactions and not B2C, a provision which still exists. But then impetus was given by making a distinction in terms of, your marketplace models and inventory-based models, and it was clearly delineated that, you can have foreign direct investments into marketplace models. On the single brand retail side, which is another relatable area of e-commerce, likes of Uniqlo, H&M, IKEA, that a lot of people throng to over the weekends and kind of want to go and, see. And I think that too has in some ways been enabled by a few policy measures also. Sometimes, of course, being reactive to the industry concerns and, of course, signals by foreign investors, and sometimes trying to proactively preempt certain changes in the industry and trying to kind of build some structure into the policy. So that's why now when you talk about e-com being conducted by the likes of Uniqlo, H&M, this wouldn't have been possible before 2015 because that's when the change came about. So the policy has evolved over the past 2 decades, and certainly there's a lot we can do in the industry, because if the past 2 years are indicative of anything, it's just that the e-com sector evolves really fast, and given the kind of demographics, the kind of innovation that we've been able to sit on witness in the past 2 years, we now have various different hybrid models, which, well, even hybrid is a little ambiguous because it's like there's so many different types of models that we have in place, wherein they have not only leveraged on the consumer sentiments, but have normalized certain things for consumers which they didn't know they really wanted earlier, quick commerce being one. So I think, on the policy side, certainly FDA policy is evolving, and that has enabled investments. As to where larger foreign investments are concerned, there've been significant investments into the country in the past 7-8 years. 27 billion odd investments came into e-com between 2014 2021. We were ranked second in terms of companies looking to make digital investments in 2021, ahead of a lot of other competing economies which have been which have jousted about being digitally enabled for a longer time. So I think there's a lot of scope for foreign investments to come in, and foreign investors have already showcased to the strength that they bring to the game. But key is, of course, for the enablers in the Indian economy to keep going the direction that they are.
Thank you, Rajat. But I notice you deftly avoided any of the IEDs that I had placed in your path, okay? But maybe if time permits, we'll come back to you. And I just want to come to Ashish. Ashish, you are actually, your growth is synonymous to the e-commerce growth. So you're actually driving neck and neck with e-commerce. So how do you see this journey?
Rightly said, right? I can't sort of deny that we are a proxy to the e-commerce industry in a way. A lot has been said about the growth vectors that are going to sort of come out in the next 2 to 3 years or 5 years. And there are 3-4 facts that I would want to sort of outlay here. One is today, out of 400 million online transacting users that we talk about 175 million of those are shopping online, right? Which in a country of our size, right, is minuscule, right? And that is supposed to be doubling up in next 3 to 4 years, if we were to believe some of the reports. That with at least one transaction per user is a massive number for any industry to sort of chase. So that, I think, in everything said and done, that is something which is an unbeatable growth vector for any industry to sort of look through. More than that, I think the industry post-COVID has grown by about 60% or so, right? And it is expected to grow by about 25 to 30% for the next 5 to 6 years. I can't imagine any other industry globally which is a multi-decadal kind of a growth story other than e-commerce industry in India. Now that is something which is happening in India. It has happened over the last 3 to 4 years, and it will continue to happen for the next 10 years with some of the growth vectors that are coming to play out. Now, 3 important aspects which I think, other than some of the things which have been outlined, and I think Mr. Mathias touched upon that a bit. So one thing is that the number of transacting users would be increasing, but they are coming from different types of avenues. So something like a social commerce, right, which is someone selling you on Instagram or Facebook, and you sort of purchasing also, and that kind of a trust ecosystem developing, that kind of a transparency layer developing, not just in tier 1 and 2 cities, but even in tier 3, 4 cities also, right? So that is an understated phenomena which is happening in the country. So social commerce, by some of the credible sources, public sources, are believed to sort of grow at about a 60% or so for the next 3 to 4 years. Now that is something which is a big trust digital ecosystem at play for the next 4 to 5 years. The other aspect that Rajat mentioned is in terms of quick commerce. Now quick commerce as a philosophy, I mean, now we are seeing 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes deliveries in tier 1 cities of groceries and your quintessentials. Now, those are some of the phenomena where I think people are trying to build viable, credible models at the back of tech, digitization. Now, once those sort of ramp up beyond tier 1 cities, I think that is another area to watch out for from a pure growth vector perspective for the next 4 to 5 years. The other aspects are the small seller ecosystem, which one of the credible steps and one of the most applauded steps from the government is in the ONDC structure that Aruna ji sort of touched upon. Now, ONDC, I think, will help us enable a lot of small seller ecosystems which are sort of untapped in different places, be it places like Surat, Nellore in down south, or let's say a Kaziranga, right? Some sort of traditional fashion which should be brought to mainframe. Those are some of the aspects which are coming out and being enabled by a unified marketplace and a fair play ecosystem that is being developed. Time will tell how that plays out, but there are a lot of aspects from the small seller ecosystem across the country which was untapped and is sort of coming at the forefront now. And those 3 or 4 areas, I think, will sort of give us enough vector for the industry to grow at a 25-30% for the next 4 to 5 years. While saying that, I think there are certain capabilities that the e-commerce players are building up, right? And we as a synonymous proxy to that are experiencing that the reach, which is to cover about, let's say 95, 97% of India with the right kind of digital means and with the right kind of pin code serviceability, almost parallel to someone like an India Post, becomes the critical underlying factor for every player in the industry. So be it Amazon, Flipkart, their logistic arms, Ecom Express, delivery, and so on, right? It becomes a very credible capability building, infrastructure building that is happening across the industry post-COVID, and that will get accelerated. So the capex spends, both in terms of infrastructure as well as in terms of serviceability, will sort of see quite a steep jump over next 3 to 4 years. Having said that, I think there is a lot of scope in terms of this internet penetration and digital infrastructure to be fair played and equal across the country. So for example, Northeast still has a lot of challenges in terms of connectivity, right? While the internet penetration at an index level may look very high, but there are pockets of J&K, Northeast, some of the parts in down south as well, where you still have those challenges in terms of right digital penetration, right? And those are, I think, capability issues for the government along with private players like ourselves to solve. The other aspects of, I think, in general, the sentiment of marketplaces to be more viable for a low ASP, low value kind of products is catching up, right? So that is another growth vector. For example, I think during COVID, all of us would have ordered a 10 rupee mask from online platforms, right? And there was a viable market for that, right? So the more low value, low ASP products being traded across platforms and across categories is something which is also happening, not just in tier 1 and tier 2 markets, but also in tier 3 and 4, right? So those are some of the vectors which give us at least a confidence and a strong belief in the growth story. And like I said, a 30-35% growth story for the next 5 to 10 years is unparalleled anywhere in the world, right? And Anil can probably agree with that. He covers different sectors and different global trends as well. This is unparalleled, right? And similar to an IT evolution or a telecom evolution that also got discussed, I think e-commerce is here as a sort of big revolution that is going to sustain for the next 3 to 4 years, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ashish. I was really struck with one point, 2-3 points you made. One, how e-commerce is creating this implicit trust quotient, which is a great point because I think one thing missing in this country is trust. So it's great that e-commerce is bridging. And the other point I liked about what you said is that this pie, this is for the incumbents like Amazon, that what you're saying is that the pie is going to grow. So ONDC, a concept like ONDC need not be challenged. It is the bigger the pie, the greater the gains. So now I'll come to my neighbor who's right at the outset told me that, look, I don't know anything about e-commerce, I only know about jobs. But she's right. I think that's one big output of the e-commerce sector. So we will turn to her to answer our expectations and fears whether this 30 billion of investment that has come in has generated the kind of jobs or has it created lots of solopreneurs?
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the invitation from the Bharati Institute of Public Policy, and congratulations on the report. I think I've been really heartened in this conversation by, Ashish and Dr. Sharma also talking about the open platform, open marketplaces, focusing in on small sellers and low value products, because I think the reality of our nation is that we really have sort of two Indias, right? A majority of our population is actually still of the low socioeconomic strata with low levels of education. And the question of how we provide jobs and how this emerging ecosystem of digital work and advancements in technology, penetration, adoption, and use, how they are interacting with what I believe to be one of the most pressing challenges of our time, which is job creation, right? So just to put this in context, I mean, we have, even pre-COVID, we had an ailing labor market. We've seen rising unemployment. There was an uptick in unemployment, and I'm talking specifically about pre-COVID, and all of this has been exacerbated post-COVID. Unemployment was about 6.1%, with youth unemployment being 3 times that, right? We know that, and we've all heard a lot about the fact that only less than 50% of our working age population is actually in the labor force, participates in the labor force. That means that only 50% of working age population are either employed or looking for work. And when we are talking about women, this number drops drastically to where it's less than 1 in 5 women that are in labor market. The global average is 48%. In India is less than 20%. It's one of the lowest in the world. Our female labor force participation rate is lower than Saudi Arabia's, right? So given this backdrop of an ailing labor market, of course, a key question is how are these advancements in e-commerce interacting with the world of work? And here, I think it's important to think through the different kinds of models of employment that e-commerce facilitates. So you might have a small business or a larger business, an e-commerce company that uses platforms to sell their wares, but then actually operates like a regular factory or a regular employer. And that is a very different nexus of the e-commerce ecosystem with employment than what is often talked about in the popular imagination of the artisanal workers in villages that are selling achar or their sewed products online through some kind of open marketplace, right? And I think there it's very important that we don't kind of lump all of these in together, because the employment impact, what we're looking for is not just how many more jobs the potential, that e-commerce can potentially generate, but also the quality of these jobs. At the end of the day, e-commerce platforms are reliant on consumers that are also workers themselves. Thank you for that point. And so it's important for us to actually consider that. When it comes to female labor force participation, I think the really key point here is, it becomes very easy for policymakers to point to the emerging digital ecosystem of work, both e-commerce but also gig work, and say that's where the demand for jobs will come from. And I think that that's hugely problematic, because like I said, in many of these aspects, the quality of jobs is in question, but also the scale of jobs that these can generate is in question. And I'll give you an example when we're talking about sort of you said solopreneurs or individual sellers. A woman that is a designer who can sit at home and design clothes and then create a boutique and sell them online is a very different employment story than the majority of where our women, our sisters sit, which is in villages or with very low levels of education or with patriarchal norms that prevent them from actually generating an income. So to what extent do we want to promote home-based models of work that actually dissuade women from going out and claiming public spaces, right? And just to wrap up here, the idea is not about e-commerce and technology bad and we shouldn't do it. I think the train has left the station. I am in full agreement with Lloyd that I think government should not be in the business of telling business what to do or instituting regulations that prevent the opportunities that e-commerce has to offer. Let me be very clear, I'm all for that. What I do suggest is that we think about careful regulations for e-commerce where it has a nexus with employment, and that we don't overestimate the ability for this growth in e-commerce to solve our employment challenge, which is much bigger and much more heterogeneous than what e-commerce allows us to address. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina, for the reality check and, on the whole issue. But I really like the point you made about the political economy of work from home. I didn't realize that till you mentioned. Thank you for enlightening me. Now, last but not the least, I come to Vinod, and it actually segues very well from Sabina because he represents the SME sector, and jobs is one thing. SMEs, it's the bulwark of India, but rarely acknowledged. So, Vinod, how do you see the e-commerce play in the context of the SME sector?
Thank you to the ISB and the Bharatiya Institute of Public Policy, and all the friends who took time off to come out here early in the morning on a weekday. Couple of things that I'd like to set, a clear perspective. The first thing is, let's go back 7 to 8 years. And I know for sure, as the head of an organization which is 12 years old, with almost 97,000 odd members from around the country, back then, the biggest issues that were facing us when we came to members were access to finance and access to markets. Now, access to finance, we all know. We've been talking to the RBI, the banks, and every day some of the other association talks to the banks and says, please give some more money to MSMEs. But we know that's not going to happen overnight, or that's not the way it's going to happen. But way back, 8 years back, at one point in time, we used to organize almost 40 workshops a month. It was like 1.5 workshops a day, simultaneous workshops for people to understand how to get access to markets. Now, what does that signify? First thing is, I have a woman, maybe in a rural area, she's making something awesome. Could be textile, could be handlooms, could be a handicraft, any product. But she was unable to get her product into the market. Nobody was willing to offer her distribution, and nobody was willing to offer her retail space or shelf space unless she paid for it. Forget just taking a commission. So we used to help them, interface with distributors, organize smaller exhibitions, out-of-home I would say, expos, and all sorts of things to help them reach out to markets. And this included with some big malls around the country. We used to take space, 3,000, 4,000 square feet, and get all of them together and say, come and sell to people. There's going to be a certain amount of people that are going to come into the mall every week. Now look at it today. During COVID, there are more than 7,000 women which have gone online, on e-commerce, on various platforms. And believe me, the success rate is far, far higher. Normally, when I see a new entrepreneur coming in and setting up a business, and I generally say it's 1 out of 3 will survive. 1 out of 3 will even get to the first year. Forget the second or the third year. But here, when you look at the current scenario, somebody just released a small report saying that, 815 odd MSMEs shut down in 1 year in Maharashtra. And those numbers are really crazy, because when you actually look at the amount of people that are shutting down every year, it's far, far greater. But when you look at what's happened to these 7,000 women that we put online during this COVID era, you'd be surprised. 84% of them are alive and kicking, and they are growing year on year. They're growing month on month. And that is the effect that e-commerce has had on the small, medium enterprise sector. When we talk about our doing workshops and getting people familiarized with, when it comes to business, for a small entrepreneur, he only knows how to produce whatever he's skilled at. He gets a couple of people together, or she gets a couple of people together, says, let's make this, and they get on to making a certain product. But nobody helps them in understanding competition or competition strategy. Nobody helps them in understanding what sort of brands are operating in your space. Nobody helps them in understanding, how do you actually package your product? What sort of packaging requirements are there? What sort of quality requirements are there for you to bring that product out? And I feel in the last 6 years, we've shut down our workshops, which were doing all this, and only thing that we do today is get people hooked onto e-commerce. And we say, that is the way you are going to sort of get trained, get educated, because today, even as a consumer, when you go online, what do? You figure out who all is selling what are the ingredients, what is the packaging, what is the branding, what sort of reviews are there, almost everything. So if you were to make a analysis of exactly what is selling in the market of a certain product, all you need to do was maybe spend 4 or 5 hours. And definitely all entrepreneurs can do that. And precisely so, it's my business. It's my business to know. Now, this could have never happened before this. Even if I would have done 30,000 programs in a year, I could have never been able to achieve this. And I keep on telling this to all associations around the country, that we should take e-commerce as the biggest thing that has happened to small, medium enterprises in India. Because it has saved us from doing what all we were trying to do. And we were still unable to reach the sort of people. You could have a workshop with 150, 200 people. But I can't have a situation where I have 500,000 people hooking onto it. I'm just trying to sort of help them with the basics, and then they get on and do it on their own. Saying that, I'm definitely looking forward to the next 10 years. And what I expect is, we should, in India, today we're talking about 1 crore odd which are registered on the MSME Udyam registration database, they are primarily organized sellers, I would say, in a way. On the other hand, we're talking about close to 20 crores, which includes retailers, manufacturers, service providers. But 19 crores are not there in the ambit. What I'm expecting is this technological revolution is going to get all of them online. They will all, we were talking about Surat. I know for Surat, for sure, a lot of members, and majority of them refuse to go on to shift to, any form of digital payments. They're all for cash, whatever reasons. But, when I talk about the next 4 or 5 years, I tell them you don't have a choice, because somebody within you is going to come out and sell next door. Sitting next door to you is going to sell not only Surat and your clientele around your area, he's going to sell to the whole world. So what are you going to do then? I'm sure over the next 3, 4, 5 years, this is going to be sort of the primary way SMEs will operate, which are basically in consumer-facing businesses. When it comes to B2B and other things, those are completely different, and there are many other platforms that are sort of being put up in the present situation. At the same time, what we also feel is the government needs to look at this very, very objectively when it comes to what benefits a small, medium enterprise is deriving from the way digital payments have happened. We are all extremely thankful to the Prime Minister for pushing digital payments. And we are also extremely thankful to some of the people that actually criticized it at first and said, this is not going to work, because that also helped the system sort of get back on its feet, make a lot of changes in the process. Finally, what we feel is the way India is doing business using UPI and other payment mechanisms, it is I think, much, much bigger than any other country in the world. And my feeling is, over the next 3-4 years, with the ONDC coming into the picture, I also know at least 50 portals which are owned by new entrepreneurs, which are also in the e-commerce space, which are going to be really big in the next 5-6 years. And they are very, very specific, very, very niche. So we today are talking about maybe 200-300 portals. My feeling is, over the next 5 years, you're going to have 1,000 more. And all of them are going to really help each and every small, medium enterprise, more than helping any large seller who can set up a shop today, who can set up a showroom across maybe 100 cities at the click of a button, which no small, medium enterprise would be able to do without this. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. You've just run out of time, but Avik, I'll just request one question I really want to ask Aruna ma'am, because it will help you for your rest of your program. And just want to close because what Vinod just said is very true. Today morning I bought a shawl made by Niamgari tribal women before coming here. So I just picked it up and I think it's a beautiful piece. And Niamgari is, I don't know how many people in the room even know where Niamgari. It is in Odisha. So, ma'am, quick question to you. You got 30 seconds to respond. I'm sorry. But, one key reason for public policy failure in India, which I think Lloyd, everyone has been alluding to, is that it incorporates even policing into it instead of being just a catalyst. So, since you've been inside and now you're outside, can you tell us whether I'm right or wrong and what is the way out?
You're absolutely right. Because what is very, very important is the payment system, there is a regulator. So there is no need to incorporate that into the sectors of digital policy and everything. So there is already existing rules, laws and everything where there can be a debate. We may agree to some of the systems, we may not agree to some of the system. Similarly, when you look at the consumer affairs, the consumer affair law is very clear. So there is no need to incorporate that in the e-commerce because the consumer redressal falls there, and that is where the withdrawal happened for the consumer affairs ministry policy on e-commerce, where they were holding the platform responsible for the quality part of it, which is the supplier's business. So that correction has also come. So therefore it is very important that there are regulatory existing laws for protecting the rights of the consumers and the payment systems and others. So when you're talking about the digital system of business, definitely it should be more a facilitator and not bring in the policing of it at all, because that is creating a lot of hindrance to the progress that is happening. That is absolutely clear.